remarks on William Franklin's apophatic path from Europe to China. So let's welcome our speaker.
Take my name now.
I should use this mic because my voice is not up to standard. Can anybody hear me? Hello? Where's the young fellow? Where's the technician?
They're outside. They're outside.
Hello?
Yes.
Is it on?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me also thank William and Nan for organizing this great colloquium. It's a great pleasure. It's an honor to be here. And I apologize for somewhat being late to this colloquium and also being, just like Sabine Müller, being another odd man out for several reasons. First of all, I'm not talking about the book that you all been talking about, that you all read, Philosophy and Sable, but on another book. And the other reason is I'm not a philosopher, I'm just a simple sonologist. So just expect nothing too profound, too deep for me. I'm also, I have to apologize for the presentation. I usually don't like to read things like that. I usually have slides too and try to move around. And but just couldn't do it this time, and I just have what it basically is a straight book report on William's next book that he already introduced to you in his initial remarks this morning. The Apophatic path from Europe to China, regions without purpose, which I had the pleasure to read as a manuscript. And I will tell you what it's all about, or at least in its basic context. Now, William mentioned this morning that he sees himself in the whole guy of the Jesuit missionaries who ventured into China and absorbed Chinese thought, transmitted it to Europe, and he is basically doing the same thing. And we could say, just like his Jesuit predecessors, William wants to open another door to China. And he chooses to be guided in this walk through the many circles of Chinese thought. It's his Virgil François Julien. François Julien takes him by his hands and leads him into Chinese thought. It is by extensively reading and engaging with the works of this French philosopher and sinologue. As you know, Julien is author of more than 30 books in which he looks into the gap, to the écart, says in French, between Western and Chinese thought. In contrast to Julien, who highlights the dissimilarities and sees in China a great other to the European tradition, Franke's intent differs in that he pursues a more universalistic agenda. His purpose is, quote, not to sharpen our focus on China. It is ultimately to see what is working in any and all cultures beyond their borders and definitions and irrespective of their specific characters. This is to say, he basically complements Julien's somewhat one-sided picture by illuminating that much of what Julien claims to discover as the great other of Europe and China can be found in the European tradition as well. That is, the neglected undercurrent to the mainstream of Western thought, the apophatic tradition. He also succeeds to show the blind spots in Julien's approach, and that Julien is entrenched in a post-revolutionary, post-enlightenment, laicistic tradition of French rive gauche intellectualism. He scorns everything that comes close to theology, and therefore he also misses the rich European tradition of negative theology as well as its precursors and successors. Now we'll go with you through all the chapters of William's book, 5 chapters and an epilogue. chapter 1 is called All or Nothing, Nature in Chinese Thought and the Apophatic Occident. In his initial chapter, William Franke wants us to discover, both in China as well as in the Western tradition, quote, a conception of nature as inherently negative, as the apophatic par excellence, end quote. According to his view, again, quote, this invisible dimension is found in the immanent inscrutability of things in nature as a process of ongoing, inarrestable change. So basically the Taoist notion. In contrast to Julien, Franke sees a dimension also in the Chinese concept of nature which he calls mystical, a vision which he considers to be accessible equally to Western and to Eastern thought. In addition, this is a universal issue. In Franke's words, the theme of nature as an all that always eludes us is thus a universal question and one that raises the possibility of some kind of relation to a universal philosophical truth. In the last subsection of this chapter, entitled Menschus, or the naturalness of morality, is the all without transcendence. Franke takes issue with Julien's interpretation of Chinese morality. The Confucian concept of morality is basically founded on the writings of Mencius, who considers heaven, Chinese Tian, to be the origin of man's inborn morality. Julien sees here a, quote, connection with transcendence, which he conceives of expressly as the absolutization and totalization of immanence. This is the way William describes it. But Julien takes Confucianism to be pure morality without religion. In contrast, Franke sees in the Chinese tradition all things as existing in relation to all in responsible reciprocity grounded in a common source. Hence he concludes, some such vision and convictions is the basis of religion in almost any culture, and it is every bit as strong in China as in the West. Only the institutional and even conceptual and imaginative forms of religion characteristic of the West are missing from Chinese classics and culture. So much for the first chapter. Now chapter 2. Nothing and the poetic making of sense. The thrust of this chapter is based on Chinese notions of poetics, that is, allusiveness, suggestiveness, the art of incitation, the saying beyond saying, and the reading of the unsaid between the lines, which Julien sees to be at the core of a Chinese discourse. But again, Franke criticizes Julien for ignoring the vast Western traditions of ineffability and points out, by referring not only to the medieval mystics but also to poets such as Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Mallarmé and Dickinson, that there is a discourse in the West just as in the East, aiming beyond discourse and beyond all its determinations. According to Franke, Julien is playing the game of oppositional thinking, and his method, quote, aims at an articulate philosophical analysis rather than at ineffable wisdom. It turns on conceptually stated and elaborated distinctions between culturally defined objects rather than on seeking above all their underlying indifferentiation. He sees in Julien's approach a discourse expressly Western and for a Western audience, which then even stereotypes, quote, Western thought as metaphysical and transcendental in contradistinction to Chinese thought of immanence. At the end of this chapter, Franke comes to the following conclusion. Critique of the West through comparison with China underlies the very intelligibility of his, that is Julien's, discourse and its raison d'être. Yet in the end, he renounces all pretensions to be able to accurately characterize Chinese thought and admits to being only incited by it to pursue his own thinking. The striking virtue of Julien is that he thinks actively along with his Chinese sources rather than only elucidating them as his object of study. This distinguishes him and often sets him at odds with traditional sinology. Franke sees in this approach also the attractiveness of Julian's work. Quote, still, it is by interacting with these sources in an original way that he or anyone else can most authentically respond to the solicitations and incitations of Chinese thought and tradition, as his oeuvre so powerfully demonstrates. He will come back in the last chapter to these questions of originality of Julian's work. Chapter 3, Immanence, the last word. So, chapter 3 deals with the question of immanence versus transcendence, according to Franke, a key issue in comparative or intercultural philosophy today. Franke's main point is that when transcendence is reinterpreted apophatically, it does not stand in opposition to immanence. Throughout this chapter, Franke pursues the matter of method in intercultural philosophy. Concretely, he sees Julian's approach in perspective to that of David Hall and Roger Ames, who, in their collaborative effort, have become, just as Julian, influential interpreters of Chinese culture for a Western audience. Franke sees them in some ways as competitors who are pursuing, quote, what is in many respects a common project. And that is, they are renouncing all pretensions to transcendence. Incidentally, I can mention at this point that William is organizing a conference, I think in exactly 2 weeks, on this, exactly on this topic, transcendence and immanence in Chinese thought. And we will not have François Julien being present here, but we will have Roger Ames, who is one of these main contenders in this discussion. David Hall and Roger Ames have become known for their project of freeing sinology from the constraints of Jesuitical interpretation. Thus, they criticize the usage or translation of many key terms, such as heaven for Tian. As necessary as it may be to explain certain key concepts when translating classical texts, there is also some reason for sticking to the usage of established terms. Franke's remarks expose the ambivalence of their approach. I quote, Hall and Ames impose their own assumptions about which assumptions contemporary English-speaking readers are going to make. This is not without pretenses and risks of its own. However much one would like to objectively represent the hermeneutic horizon of one's own culture, there are inevitably ideological biases that play into one's interpretive acts. Accordingly, concerning the usage of terms like heaven or transcendence, some interpreters find the terms to be applicable, others not. Here, Franke has a piece of wisdom to offer. Quote, instead of putting all our effort into disputing which is the right term or the better description, as if we could legislate what is or is not appropriate, we should concern ourselves with how to take all terms and descriptions as partial and provisional. Surely, this is closer to the spirit of Chinese wisdom and also to its nearest Western analogues in the vision and method and to their implied theories of language. Seen apophatically, the dispute about transcendence, in Franke's eyes, is futile as, quote, it deals with representations of transcendence, whereas what is really at stake in the question of transcendence is the unrepresentable. No representation of transcendence is appropriate to Chinese thought, and yet nothing is so important to this wisdom as what transcends representation, and this goes for Western thought too. The error that Franke is pointing out in Hall and Ames and others' polemic against transcendence as it relates to Chinese thought is simply that, quote, in campaigning for its exclusion, they fall back into the delusion of discriminating between right and wrong forms of imagery for the formless. Instead, it is important to see that, quote again, limit words like transcendence remind us of the limits of any language, whatever, and they point us toward something beyond words and representations. In addition, for Hall and Ames, transcendence is a topic virtually defunct in the West. Hence, they see a certain irony when Chinese scholars are, quote, foolishly following a failed model. Franke, on the other hand, views the anti-transcendence prejudice of Hall and Ames as an attempt, quote, to gain traction and make the discourse persuasive to their predominantly secular-minded contemporary audiences. What is accurate or not in describing another culture is culture-dependent, and Hall and Ames, in the end, claim validity for their interpretation only in our specific cultural context, presumably the modern, secular, Western world. Franke ends this chapter wisely by stressing that, quote, transcendence too should be left open as a question rather than being shut down dogmatically. We do not know what transcendence means, after all, if it really transcends our understanding and concepts. In the epilogue, he adds some advice to this insight when he suggests the contenders of such controversies to better hold their convictions in suspense. Chapter 4, Universalism or the Nothing That Is All. The first part of this chapter is devoted to Julian's exploration of the Western idea of universality and its history, which goes back to Greek conceptual thought. Knowledge by abstraction, claimed universality of logical thinking, but also to biblical religion and especially to Christianity with its missionary spirit. Quote here, I think this is from Julian. This power of abstract logical thinking has enabled the Western model of civilization to impose itself, brooking no opposition from one end of the globe to the other. According to Julien, Europe developed, quote again, the idea of its own exceptionalism, of its having a unique right to rule and a mission to educate and to civilize all peoples. Case in point are human rights. Quote, if they are defined and spelled out, they inevitably reflect a certain cultural code and its attendant biases. Later on in this chapter, Franke also deals with critics of Julien, such as Fabian Heubel, who accuses Julien for being blind to the realities of hybridization in modernity. That is to, quote, the actual fertilization of one culture by another in the present, in which horizons fuse so that ancient and modern can no longer be neatly separated. I will come back to Fabian Heubel's criticism in the back at the end of my paper. Julien indeed is juxtaposing two independent worlds, China and the Occident, against each other in a binary fashion, which Franke sees to be Julien's own figments. They are produced by his discourse, even before they are realities independent of it. Every binary is, in some sense, a product of language and conceptualization. At the end, Franke turns again to the question of immanence versus transcendence. He sees the lack of a transcendent position in Julien as an expression of a certain cultural bias or a certain anti-theological polemic that is complicit with the history of Western atheism, characteristic of Parisian philosophers and of other secular-minded philosophers. When Julien interprets immanence, quote, as close to theological transcendence, so as to declare human and secular autonomy and self-sufficiency, Franke considers him not to be in accordance with the Chinese classics. He says, for their vision does remain open to a dimension of transcendence. It is a dimension that cannot be grasped conceptually, and yet it lends itself to being variously figured as sacred and divine. When Julien speaks of absolutization and totalization of immanence, Franke points out that this absolute immanence transcends our conceptual framework too. Such an understanding of immanence, which we also find in Deleuze, actually, quote, presupposes transcendence and most obviously self-transcendence as the very life principle that keeps immanence alive and on the move. Returning to Chinese wisdom, Franke concludes, a cultural bias in favor of secularism easily leads to the exclusion of the sacred, but surely the balance and interpretation of the two is the way that classical Chinese thinking teaches. Last chapter, 5, an extra word on originality. This chapter looks into what Franke calls Julien's originality. He captures it thus. The unique conceptuality that Julien invents, since it is expressed in French, is inevitably a hybridization importing ancient Chinese concepts, while at the same time contaminating them with the predispositions and propensities of his own modern European, specifically native French language and thought. Now he compares Julien's case with that of Ernest Fenello's. It is well known that at a momentous turning point in modern cultural history, Fenollosa's essay, The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry, that was published in 1906, had a great impact on modern Western poetry, particularly on the so-called modernists and imagists around Ezra Pound, Emily Dickinson. In this way, it helped to bring about a radical renewal of the art of poetry in the West. Fenollosa's view of the Chinese language in relationship to poetry was later refuted as an erroneous understanding of Chinese writing by important sinologists such as George Kennedy or James Leo, the later in his classic The Art of Chinese Poetry, 1962, which was one of my first reading about Chinese poetry. But this did not diminish its impact, for, as Franke observes, this reception seems to have had more to do with the way that the essay answered to strivings on the part of modern, especially Anglo-American poets after originality than with its adhering to the actual modalities of development and expression characteristic of the Chinese language. And he concludes, the originality of Fenollosa's essay can serve in this way as a foil to illuminate particular kind of contested originality that also distinguishes Julien's oeuvre and makes it so exceptionally interesting. The point is, and it has already been made in the previous chapters, that Julien's work fits, quote, into a considerable history of integrating Chinese texts and traditions into philosophical reflection attuned to the problematics of Western culture. At the end of this chapter, Franke points out, interestingly, that this French thinker, Julien, and his Anglo-Saxon counterparts, Hall and Ames, although joined in a few common goals, hardly take note of each other. This he considers to be due to the fact that Hall and Ames are pursuing an agenda imbued with American pragmatism, whereas Julien is more indebted to French postmodernism. And American pragmatism appears to be, as he says, in certain ways at loggerheads with continental tradition out of which Julien works. Get to the epilogue, which is entitled Intercultural Dialogue and its Apophatic Interstices. In the epilogue, William Franke returns to the two mostly disputed topics that he has with Julien. That is the status or function of transcendence and what both refer to as the theological. Particularly regarding the latter, Franke does not tire to show that he is not far from Julien's insights when theology is understood as negative theology. Quote, a certain apophaticism is in its essence a rigorous and sometimes an aggressive critique of every concept, especially of every theological concept. There is, of course, a lot in common between Western apophaticism and Chinese wisdom as expounded by Julien. If we look at the strain of thought that leads from Neoplatonism over certain mystic philosophers of the Middle Ages, Pseudo-Dionysus, Areopagita, Jean Scotus Erigena, or Maimonides, Meister Eckhart, Nicholas Cusanus, till modernity with Jacques Derrida or Samuel Beckett, we can see that, quote, there is a radical reflection on the inevitable failure of all narrowly rationalizing discourse. Hence it is not by refusing the displacement to China, but by complementing it through reflections bearing on this other Occident, that of the unsayable, end quote, that William Franke enters into dialogue with François Julien. As to the main bone of contention between Franke and Julien, the concept of theology, dismissed by Julien as a philosopher and tradition of French laicité, Franke explicates the central ideas of negative theology, such as talking, that is, about God, as not talking, hence as not doing, or like Wu Wei in the Chinese tradition. As Dionysius Areopagita has it, of God is ultimate reality beyond our capacity to know, and even simply to conceive. Nothing can be predicated, but nothing can be denied of or excluded from such a God either. Everything is theophany, and all things together constitutes God's self-revelation. End of quote. Hence, instead of being taken as significant concepts, terms like God, transcendence, the unconditioned, or the absolute can be, quote, employed only in order to be subsequently emptied of sense. God or transcendence cannot be represented except as the condition and at the same time the negation of all possible representations, that is, as the unrepresentable, as the unconditioned. Regarding the dispute on immanence versus transcendence, Frank again points out the difference between these concepts themselves on the one hand and representations thereof on the other. Quote, we cannot think of immanence as a separate thing or as an objective fact. At the most, we can speak of representations of immanence and equally of representations of transcendence. And at this level of representation, it is perfectly clear that the one, immanence, is the negation or the opposite of the other, transcendence. For that reason is implicated in it. Therefore, it is not a question of choosing one rather than or without the other. Transcendence is immanence, and vice versa. When Franke recommends that we let things be what they are and permit them to manifest their thus, French, ainsi in Julien's vocabulary, in the spirit of Gelassenheit or letting be, as described, for example, by Meister Eckhart, one is also reminded of a concept with which Buddhists try to capture the ineffable ultimate reality, that is, thusness, ta-ta-ta. Things are just the way they are, as the Chinese translation of ta-ta-ta as zhenru really like suggests. Insight into ultimate reality can be gained, for example, when one observes the wind blowing through a cornfield. No word necessary. Concerning French laicism and certain, quote, certain triumphalistic versions of the philosophy of the Enlightenment, end quote, Franke argues that these are also fixed positions and biases that are at risk of becoming cultural blindnesses or atavisms. Admitting his own parti pris for theology, Franke takes up the cudgels on behalf of religion. I quote, history furnishes much evidence that wherever religion and civil society are cut off and isolated from each other, both turn out as a result to be denatured and, in certain respects, become incomprehensible. The authentic religiosity of the human being is not something other than its social tie, not therefore something to exclude. End of quote. In this context, he also refers to the acknowledgement of religion lately by Jürgen Habermas in his famous speech, Glauben und Wissen, Faith in Knowledge, which he gave upon being awarded the Peace Prize in the Frankfurt Book Fair in 2001. At the end of the book, Franke again turns toward the question of universality. He finds in Julien's work aspects of Chinese thought that he understands as aspiring to a type of universality, but they remain implicit in his words, and can as such, quote, in principle be only negative in any of its expressions. Hence he concludes, true to his apophatic agenda, the universal would reveal itself before all as that which cannot be seen. Summing up, Franke's book may be characterized as a discussion of intercultural philosophy and an engagement with representative writers, foremost François Julien, but also David Hall and Roger Ames on a high intellectual level. By highlighting Western phenomena that are comparable to the Chinese, mainly in the apophatic tradition, Franke succeeds in exposing the biases and blind spots in Julien's as well as in Hall's and Ames' respective treatment of Chinese philosophy. In his critique of their approach, he is not alone, as the cited examples of Robert Smith, Jean Lévy, Fabian Heubel, or Zhang Gang amply show. Let me quote Heubel with his criticism a little more extensively now at the end. Heubel